thank everyone for coming here tonight on behalf of the Poco River National Wildlife Refuge and the Friends of the Refuge. My name's Kate Murray. I'm on the board of the Friends. And for those of you who are here who appreciate the refuge for its natural beauty and the wildlife that it protects, I hope that you'll consider volunteering for us or becoming a friend of the refuge. The Refuge Friends right now are undertaking a fundraising project. Those of you who are familiar with Hellcat Trail knows that the boardwalks are pretty old. They're wooden, they don't last very long under those conditions, and the refuge, those trails were designed 40 years ago. The refuge is a little more than halfway through designing replacement trails that I'm happy to say will be accessible trails. And I'm hoping that they get built before I need my walker. So I just would encourage you to think about making a contribution to that project. I'm very excited tonight to introduce Victor Maston. Victor is the Director and Chief Archaeologist for the Massachusetts Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources. Did I get it right?
That's correct. I wouldn't pick that title.
Well, and some of you may recognize him because from time to time you'll see his photo in our local papers, perhaps over at the Damon, the wreck that's off of Cranes Beach, or up on Salisbury Beach, with both shipwrecks and these weird imprints in the ocean side several months ago. He's been doing this for over 30 years. Imagine how much fun it must be to solve puzzles looking at historical clues that have been found on our shore and under our ocean surfaces. So very interested to hear what Victor has to share with us tonight, and I hope you join me in welcoming Victor Maston.
Sort of just to give you a little more introduction about myself, I am a North Shore boy. I'm in the house that I grew up in, not because I wanted to be there, but that's the way not wills, because it's not at that point now, but that's just the way life goes. I started out as an archaeologist back in the mid-70s, and I considered being paid. Once I got a paid job, I was a professional. It didn't matter what I did. So I've been doing this for over 40 years. And I've done terrestrial as well as maritime. Maritime was just a good gig that came up at the right time when I needed a job. And I'm very pleased that I got picked for that job. But having looked at all the resumes, technically I was the only one qualified. So that's the way life is. But in any event, I also do work in the refuge. We sort of informally partner with the Fish and Wildlife Service on their property, so I will mention a few sites here, or a site when we get to it. So don't be surprised. I like to start this talk, and this is a little different. You also can see that there's a missing part of the title if you really look at it closely.
Yes.
It's our hidden history. It was my cut and paste to put it back on this morning when I wanted to up this a little bit, up the show. But I like to start with this slide of the 80K Damon over it. It's actually at Steep Hill Beach. It shows you how old this slide is because we sort of get more local as you get longer doing this. But what I like about this slide, and you see that specifically we put dates on it. And typically I won't put a date down on a slide, but you see that the 80K Damon was a schooner built in Essex in 1875, had a long fishing career, and then became, I guess what they call them, a sand dogger. They come up here to Plum Island because Plum Island sand, the silica content of Plum Island sand was one of the best silica contents for making cement, plaster, and certain other materials like that. And so it's highly desirable and free. But anyway, on her way up here, and I'm going to use she because I was trained traditional, so it sounds sexist, but it's not meant to be. She was on her way up here, hit the bar on the outside on Christmas Eve because they're anxious to make money, and got pushed in by a storm in 1909. Total wreck. By total means they couldn't get it off the beach, they took everything off, and you can see a pretty strip there, 1909. By 1911 it stripped more, but it's changed its life. It's not a fishing vessel. Now it's entertainment, recreation. People having a picnic. The estate had its annual Ipswich picnic down there. By 1904, when I first heard about this, imagine I've been on the job since 87, and I didn't hear about this wreck until 2004. Well, we have 3,500 wrecks in Massachusetts, so it's understandable, at least from my perspective. Went out there, looked at it, disappeared within another season. We were going to teach on that wreck with the trustees, disappeared, and then in 2015 it came back out. What I'd like you to take out of these 4 photographs is look at Steep Hill. So you can see it, just a bit of it in the top 1909. Pretty bald. Same in 1911. It's like almost clear cut. There's not really a lot of growth. And then as you come into the modern Steep Hill, it's heavily forested. And you can't really see it as well in these photographs, but the dunes are pretty extensive and high. And in the current dunes, they're pretty low. But also the wreck. The beach is different. That wreck is at a different angle to the beach that you go to. And so that beach, there's a coastal process that goes on, and whether or not that wreck's interfering with that process or it's benefiting from it, I don't know. But sometimes it's parallel to the beach, sometimes it's almost perpendicular, depending on the shape of Steep Hill Beach. So it does change seasonally as well as over the long course. Well, I want to start a little bit is talking about wrecking ships versus shipwrecks. So I'm going to talk to you about maritime archaeology first, because I think you need to understand a little bit about where I come from professionally in terms of really understanding the points that I want to make. Wrecking ships, that's what everyone thinks about is when they say shipwreck. This picture on the left is what most people think about. And what I really find amazing, this is a local wreck. See all these folks down here? See, here's the wreck. Wicked waves. This is Lynn Beach, so you know it's a fairly shallow beach. But really horrible. I don't believe this actually was pilot. I think this is just the artist taking little liberties. But what's really important, you see all these folks down here? You know why they're there? They're not there to help anybody. They're not there to, shall we say, salvage anything. Because that's what the first thought, they're there to get anything came up. They're there for entertainment. This is 1802. This is the Vernon. What are you doing in Lynn? There's nothing to do. Get down there watching the wreck. And this is very common. That people come down and watch the wreck and then they grab whatever they can, even though that's illegal then, as it is today. But what I typically deal with is the picture on the right. An anonymous shipwreck. Only part of it. And my job is to figure out what vessel it is. And about 99% of the time, I'm going to tell you, I have absolutely no idea. Or we all think we know what it is, and I look at certain pieces of evidence and they'll say, absolutely can't be that vessel for certain components. This vessel I'm going to talk about a little bit later, it really intrigued us because it looked like, oh wow, this is a really neat vessel. Here's the keel, it's coming out on the beach, and it turns out this isn't the keel. So what's maritime archaeology? It's really any kind of archaeology that we use. It's either related to the marine or wet environment. So if I talk about maritime archaeology, marine archaeology, nautical archaeology, or underwater archaeology, it's all the same from the perspective of how you deal with it. For me, there's some nuances, but they're not critical. But it's really archaeology is just conducted in that medium. And there's different things we look at. So on the extreme left is Buzzards Bay, complete deep body of water today. 20,000 years ago, Buzzards Bay was a river valley. And this is a reconstruction done by USGS. So those are things that interest me. And we'll get into this sort of coastal process. Diving, though I hate doing it myself now. It's wicked cold. I get kind of claustrophobic. And if I can't wear my glasses, I can't see. So it really takes a lot of pleasure out of diving. Not all things are shipwrecks, like lighthouse, I'm going to talk about that up at the top. Aircraft, dealing with an aircraft now from World War II, off of Martha's Vineyard, Cape Pogue area. That's a training area. The aircraft we're dealing with. This isn't from there. That's actually from Buzzards Bay, another trainer. This one, the pilot survived. The one we're dealing with now was a catastrophic event. We believe the pilot and gunner their bodies were claimed and buried, but we're not 100% sure. So that's some of that. There could be wharfs, jetties, any kind of structure that's in the water, whether it's a vessel or not, is important to me as an archaeological resource. Types of underwater sites, well, shipwrecks, and here, this is what I deal with, type of shipwreck. So in the top left, that is the city of Rockland on Little Misery Island. We're actually going to take a field school out there this summer for a week, and we'll do some documentation. That's a coastal freighter passenger vessel from the turn of the century to I think the 30s is when it finally bought the farm there. Ship's ways, looks like just logs in a river. This river is the North River in Norwell, probably about as wide as this room. 300-ton vessels were launched in that river. Not a perpendicular, not parallel, at an angle at high tide. Submerged terrestrial sites, so these are Paleo-Indian points. Not from Massachusetts, but we do have a site here in Bullbrook and Ipswich where they did find points like this, and they are found along the Merrimack Valley. Or underwater buildings. We sometimes get old jetties, building foundations, and I'm going to talk about a set of sites, but probably the most common thing to think about, think of Quabbin Reservoir. They may have taken all the buildings down, but if you side scanned sonar at that and did some remote sensing, you'd actually see the foundations for the buildings there because they didn't backfill those. They left those open. But not all underwater sites or maritime sites are underwater in the end. In the Seaport District 2 years ago, they're constructing the foundations for one of the new towers at about, I don't think it's 150, it's probably 120 Seaport Boulevard. And as the construction crew is excavating, they see all this white powder. They get a little nervous because typically white powder is not what you encounter. What do you encounter? And they start thinking asbestos and it'd be a hazardous waste site. At the same time, their construction headquarters is in the 8th floor of the adjacent building, and they're looking down and they find that it's a lozenge-shaped white stain. And then when they go down and look at it closely, it's encased by wood. What it actually was the outline of a vessel. It's a lime schooner carrying lime. What most people don't know is that lime, that white powder. We probably know what lime is. When I talk to a school group today, if I say lime, all they can think about is putting that wedge in a drink. They have no idea that it's that white powder that gets thrown on your lawn. It's that same material. Lime and salt water are not friendly companions. Once they get together, you get extreme heat, which causes spontaneous combustion. This vessel burnt to the lowest part of the vessel, below the water line. They took no ballast. Lime schooners took only cargo. They loaded the kegs. The kegs are probably about this large, maybe about this round. And all we found was the very last layer of half kegs. It had burned and finally been completely inundated, so there's no oxygen to keep the process going. And they all had casts, usually have labels on them, but painted stencil. We got Rockall, and that's Rockland, Maine. And that was the main export port in New England for lime. Closer to home here is Tide Mill. People don't realize how, when we see mills, we might think of the Jewel Mill down here on Route 1 in Rowley, when it used to be the Jewel Mill. I remember that. But people don't think of mills, they think of water wheels. They don't really think of tidal power or tidal energy. Almost every creek on Cape Ann had a tide mill. It could be as narrow as could be, there's enough energy generated from tidal flow. This is on Walker's Creek. It's usually where the clammers park their trucks before they go out to the flats. If you follow that path down, you come to a lot of stone in the middle of the creek. That's the remains of the mill and dam that was a lumber mill. Or another structure is a fish weir on the Tucket River in East Bridgewater. There's a Native American fish weir. Fish mill before, I'm sorry. That dates from the beginning of Plymouth Plantation and back a few hundred years at least. We have not dated it cleanly, but that was a Native American fish mill. We capture alewife, eel was very common trap, and fish, shad, all the same species we go after today. 10,000 years ago, they were still there. But that was an area that fishery is still there today, and it's actually found in deeds from Plymouth Colony, dividing the area. So it gives us a little clue into the past. Finding sites, it's not just, I just don't go out and serendipitously find things, we tend to survey. I just want to show you this image, mostly because this was an unknown shipwreck site, we thought it was unknown. It was found during the LNG pipeline survey more than a decade ago. But we use a lot of technology in underwater archaeology, and that's how we differ from land archaeology for the most part. In this case, we have the big blue stain, our pentagonal structure of the vessel, with the technology today that we can know where our boat is. That red circle with a cross is the ROV, this remotely operated vehicle down here. Oh, got this. So the ROV is this instrument here. This is our former assistant. That's why I'm chief, because I had an assistant. He now works for New Hampshire. And we could actually take this and we can set up systems so we can actually go over wrecks systematically, like we do on land on a land site. So that ROV would go back and forth, in theory, along those straight lines. In reality, no, it doesn't happen. They're like currents or nervous operators, because ROV operators are always worried about losing the equipment. I see, you got an insurance policy. Who cares? But they don't like that talk. But anyway, during this survey, they found a vessel, and when they were surveying the vessel, he got close up at one point, and we captured this one image on the video. And you see that bottom right image, the shiny chain and new line? Don't expect to find that on a shipwreck, especially an old wooden wreck. We expect to see rusty chain and really gnarly, colonized, catted ropes. Well, that's brand new rope that goes up to a lobster pot with a number on it. But we still didn't know what the vessel was, but we knew that this was purposely chained, because usually you don't use chain on the traps. And it turned out that gentleman who registered to, it was an expired registration, but they keep those records forever. Lived a half a mile from me, had his phone number, gave him a call, and he was surprised we knew who he was, meaning I knew who he was. I found out through the environmental police. I just asked them to run the numbers for me. And anyway, he gave me the coordinates, and it turned out to be the Breton Reef lightship. And why is Breton Reef's off of Rhode Island? What's that lightship doing here? It was on its way to Beverly to be turned into a restaurant in the 60s. And he had turned it into a recreational dive site. But to get the sense is we do very systematic survey work. We have to do a lot of investigation to determine whether it's a valuable site. Is it important? Is it something that needs to be elevated for greater protection, or whether it is just an old wreck that doesn't have any historical or archaeological value. What's not good in this picture, and I should have added, is they also become habitats. There's some beautiful sea anemone gardens out there. They love wooden shipwrecks. Because typically most people think I want to find this, I want to find these, the Vasa or I can't think of the name of that Viking ship, or Norse ship. But we never find intact vessels. We tend to find stuff. And in this case, this is just assorted material that came out of the ocean from different sites. Shoe leather from a Revolutionary War wreck. Nails from another wreck from the same period, some copper nails. This bottom left-hand piece, what I want you to see here is you see the top and then you can see the bottom. It was a mystery piece for us for a little while because it's about this big. So too small to be a chamber pot and too big to be most of the things we think about. Or just random stuff that comes off of George's Bank when they're dragging for scallops. And you can see this sort of temporal variety. A lot of wooden sheaves of ships. Those are part of the pulley system on your block and tackle. The blocks are gone, but the sheaves are still there. Oil can, part of a Chianti bottle, so we know that's really not ancient. Plate from a steamer. Didn't want to do the dishes. Off it goes. What I find interesting about this piece, and it's hard for people to identify, I should have brought it because I was actually at the lab today. It's about this big. We had to use the maker's mark. So that's sort of a date stamp maker's mark. Just when you buy China today, and those change over time, just like advertising logos. So by looking at that, we could date it, got to a catalog, and finally figured out what it was. It has two handles. It looks like it had a lid, but the lid wasn't on the wreck. And that actually came off a lime schooner as well. That's irrelevant to what it is. What might anyone guess? Something about a vessel about this big ceramic was? It's not a chamber pot.
Spittoon.
No, sort of in the same category, going the opposite way. It's a sugar bowl, for lump sugar. Yeah, because I'm thinking about, when I got the catalog, I said sugar bowl, and I'm looking at the, I'm thinking, sugar bowl, yeah. My mother's got sugar bowls, they're this big. No, it's for lump sugar. And that's what you would get in 1910. You wouldn't get in granulated sugar, you're getting the lumps. Also, these objects can tell us a lot about what they're made of. I won't read all this, but there are clues. We look at the things to help us determine what we found, where it might be going, where it came from. Sometimes about the people that are involved. I have to get into my cheat sheet now, because now we're getting into the part of the script that's a little bit new. So now we're getting to the topic at hand. Can you find out, what can we find out from the past about the present? Pleistocene megafauna. That's the technical term for prehistoric mammoths, mastodons, sloths, tiger, saber-toothed tiger, those big animals that lived on Earth probably 100,000 to 40 to 20,000 years ago and then disappear. Well, off of nearby, this is brought from another archaeologist, Dr. Stephen Clayson. He's been doing research on trying to get fishermen to tell him where they find tusks, teeth, bones. Well, he has two, a mammoth and mastodon tooth found on the delta for the Merrimack River. So just north of here, or just east of us here. And that talks about, to me, that talks about a period of time between 20 and 10,000 years ago. In this case, they would date it. One of these, the top left mammoth tooth was dated to 1350, 13,500 years before today. The one on the bottom, so you get a mammoth, mastodon tooth, not dated, but fits that same period. And then there's another mastodon tooth found off of Provincetown, about 25 miles out. Dragon just pulls it up. These guys collect them. We don't, even if they're in state waters, we just want to know where. We don't want them. I mean, I'd love to have one for the office. So you go and give a school program, you bring it. And I believe in letting people touch real objects. I don't believe in making them sacred and don't touch them, because that sort of gets people interested in collecting. But there's a market for this. It's a lot of draggers will collect that if they're interested, and it's then off to the sale now on eBay, but not always. But anyway, we're talking about when the area offshore that's now at the bottom at 90 feet, 100 feet was dry land. There was so much dry land at a certain point that what you have is a process going on of landscape being preserved. So we have an offshore landscape with that those teeth and bones suggest to us. And then as you get closer, you get a landscape that, appearing in modern times, it's really ancient. And what we have here are what we call the remnants of sunken forests. And you hear about it every once in a while, usually not in our area, but they'll talk, in Europe they found this ancient forest in the North Sea. Well, this is the same thing. These are cedar tree trunks. Cedar is a freshwater coastal species versus a saltwater species. And we've got actually 3 that I know of, sunken forests in Massachusetts. I don't have the map that shows all of them. So Long Beach on the Rockport, Gloucester line, there's a sunken forest there. Then in Duxbury, and then down South Cape, and that's what I'm showing you here. And if you look really closely, and if you can hear me, I hope my voice carries. So there's peat coming out of the sand. But right above it, there are the tree trunks. There's about 40 of these. I just don't have a good image that I can show you of them. This is work by Dr. Chris Mayo, who's now up at the University of Alaska. But what Chris had done radiocarbon dating on these and found them to be about 1200 AD, maybe, a little bit earlier. And they had that common, and probably based on where they are on the shoreline, it's the same thing. But it's a process, and I'll talk a little bit more later about it. Essentially, you have the dune, the 4 dunes that we have out of the beach. Behind the dunes, you usually have a marshy area like we have here with a huge estuary. But it's saltwater intruded. At one point in time, it was a huge estuary that was just fresh water. And as sea level rises and salt water intrudes, it changes the environment. And if you look at this top image, you can see the dead trees of dead cedar in a swamp that used to be fresh water. It's now salt because of sea level rise. And in these cases, not only is sea level rise, but the forebeach is gone. And that's the case here. I'm going to talk a little bit later about Salisbury, and I recently looked at a White Beach in Manchester, where the forebeach is gone, but you can see the outer granite islands, but the current beach was actually the back shore of a freshwater pond. And that's what you had here. This freshwater pond, this was like that 1,200 years ago. So you got these clues that tell us about the locale, or greater processes that are going on. Now, I sort of mentioned the clay beds, and two people had gotten in touch with me, Bill Sargent and Sandy Tilton, and said, come on, we found horseshoe prints. And it's kind of cool because I didn't want to drive down to the ones in Eastham that came out in March. I said, I hate going to the Cape. I don't like Cape Ann, I just don't like Cape Cod. Oh, I said that on tape, I'm sorry. It was one of those things where most of the time I get called about a week after something is found. The tides have changed and the sand has come back in, and I've made a trip for nothing. So I didn't go down. When they called me and they said, hey, we've got this. Immediately, I had to find time to get out there, and we did. And there's a pictures. I think these might all be Bill's photographs, but I'm not sure. But you can see clearly the horseshoe prints. Probably mid to late 19th century on a clay bed, not a peat bed. Most likely not doing it, probably working on salvage off the beach. The forebeach that you see today was the forebeach that we had 200 or 300 years ago. The beach when this clay bed was part of a pond is probably about 1,000 to 1,500 years ago or earlier, or later than that. But what they intrigued me with is the prints that they found. And it was really cool because we're talking about, you can see the set of prints in the bottom picture, parallel tracks. I'm looking at them when I first got there. It looks like tractor tracks, except there's only one set, and there's no place else in that area where there's a second set. And Sandy looks like someone walking backwards. And if you're taking horses and you're dragging something, usually you're not walking this way. You're usually walking backwards. It made perfect sense. And then Bill and I talked quite a bit about what was there. And Bill said, behind Crane Estate in the dunes, there are old cranberry bogs. And those are clay bottoms on most of those bogs. And it just makes sense that this is probably the environment that was there at the time, as opposed to a freshwater swamp. You've got a freshwater bog for cranberries. And it just sort of gets you that what's change is going on here. But also change isn't, I guess I changed the order. Also, some of the change we see is what's different on a beach. So they noticed footprints in the clay. This beach was large stones, so say 2-gallon bucket-sized stones on a beach that was completely sand. Wow. What were they doing there? So we went out to look, and most likely they had been brought later in probably the late 19th, early 20th, or mid-20th century to make a fire pit. But as we walked the beach, we found the evidence of ancient Native American habitation of that area. So that we got a nice lens above the glacial tills and below the sands. So we didn't actually collect up with this. We saw no diagnostic artifacts, so we didn't see any projectile points, arrowheads, or scrapers. We saw some stone like this bottom piece that looks like it's been pecked a little bit, but it was in situ. It's not diagnostic for age, so we just left it in place, and it's in a state park, so it shouldn't be collected. But again, coastal process is eroding and exposing these sites because of sea level rise. Or here, so the reverse. I'm going to show you this in another photograph and another image. If you notice the wood planks, that's actually part of what we think is what they call it's a double-ender type vessel. I just blanked, and I didn't write it in my notes because I know it by heart. A gundalo. So if you go up to Portsmouth, strawberry bank. Actually, you can ride on the gondola. Those are ubiquitous colonial trading, but not trading, but it's like cargo craft or barges. Well, this is probably part of a gondola. Notice how much marsh is above it. And this is in the North River. And there's actually a shipbuilding site right above here. You get several feet of marsh. I couldn't get in there. That marsh was so punky and soft. And when you're working by yourself or with one other person, many times you don't want to get into that mire. But we got down, we could see those are wooden trunnels, tree nails, or pegs as you might call them, right here. Those aren't iron. The way it's put together, we're pretty certain that that's a colonial period one. But what you notice is how much marsh is built up above the wreck. And here, we can even date one. Now this isn't a wreck. This looks like a log. You're going down the Essex River, you see this log. And you'll see logs in the marsh all the time. Well, if you're someone who's doing research, and it wasn't me, this gentleman was doing genealogical research, and he said, this is coincidental that I'm seeing this log right where I think there should be a bridge in colonial period. And he went over and he looked at this, and we went later, and he had mortise and tenon joinery in that log. That log on the side that was visible from the water, oh yeah, it's round, looks like the bark's all off it. When you got up close, you could see it had been adze flat on both sides. And if you look at the bottom right, it's the footings, how footings would fall for sort of a medieval colonial bridge. There wasn't a lot of engineering changes. This is ancient Roman technology that just keeps going forward. That bridge dated to 1665, and it was knocked out in a real bad ice storm in the winter. Just river flow ice just pulled it out, destroyed it. The upside for the people of Chabaco or Essex Village was the fact that they no longer had to walk to Ipswich to go to church on Sundays. Mm-hmm. They could get their own parish. And they had been arguing for a parish, and evidently they had divine intervention, and that storm pulled out the bridge, isolating them from Ipswich, then forcing the question of developing their own meeting house. So it has a serendipitous, a positive effect. But notice again, the building of the marsh above it, certainly that sinks into the substrate, but it's not going to sink about 4 feet into the substrate. A couple of feet maybe, most likely not, because the cribbing in a sense is partially buoyant, just the way the structure is built. Well, we're on the sort of change in that environment. I bring this image in. This is a dugout canoe from Lake Quinsigamond, mainly because this vessel is now, there's 3 of them at 26-foot depth in Lake Quinsigamond. They weren't sunk to be at 26 feet. What ancient Native Americans did is when they made a dugout canoe for the winter period, because it takes so much labor to create it, they actually sunk them over the winter, and then in the spring they would take the stone out and retrieve it. Obviously these weren't retrieved, but they're not free diving to 26 feet when you got a thermocline with a surface water of 60, and at 10 feet it goes down to 38. From personal experience, I will tell you it is not a very comfortable change. But in any event, this lake has several things have taken place here. The lake has been dammed so that the water level has risen. So if that changed to the environment, the vessels could have slid down because on the end of 2 of them are on the end of a slope. One is not, so it kind of gets away from the theory of being put at 6 feet, too far to the edge, and winter ice kind of pull them out and drop them. Or they could have been purposely sunk deep for non-retrieval. This one that you see, radiocarbon dated to 1660, which is roughly when they were doing Christianization of the Indians in that area. So Plymouth Colony was sending out Elliot to do that. What I love about this image, you see, that's not the visibility. The 2 on the right are what we would see. I'd see about 3 feet if I was really lucky in a dive on this site. So we did a photo mosaic. We had a volunteer who did a photo mosaic, and he got the entire vessel in 40 images, with about a 75% overlap. What's really cool to me, and you might actually see it in this one, nice bottle in there. It's green. They drink Heineken. I realized that they were trading with the Dutch, and they were having Heineken. Just want you to know that. But it's cool that we see all these rocks, and that one that looks like a skull is not a skull. That really intrigued us because we had the drop camera go down and look at it. It's like the diver comes back up. It's just a rock with some really odd holes. But it actually has seats cut into it. What's kind of fun is you got the archaeologist who goes down and does a nice drawing, and then we get the image of photographs, and they don't quite match. But we're not sure. When you take 40 photographs and try to make them into one big photograph, the computer program, it likes to manipulate the data so that things meet. So we don't know if that curve is actually natural, that's what's happening, or whether the software has decided to manipulate the image and give us this nice curve to fill in the voids. Here's some think about storm action. This looks like, again, tree stumps. And it's actually back in that image I showed you, that's that same marsh. Those aren't tree stumps. We were fortunate to go out with the naturalists from, this is the Wacoit Bay Natural Marine Research Reserve down in Mashpee. Their chief scientist was doing some work out there, and he said, I think I found a shipwreck. So we go out with him, and sure enough. And he knew it because it's kind of the shape, and he found the copper spike and an iron spike as well. That was navigable. There was no opening that we can find in historic maps to bring in boats in there. So what's it doing in there? Only logical thing, it's flat enough area that it's overwash. And when we're doing study of the sunken forest, they can find these really fine layers of sand every once in a while showing severe storm action. So you get an overwash, something gets dragged from the offshore and just pushed up and in. This is a half a mile from the beach today. Probably when it was deposited, it was probably more like a mile. So you get that flow, that king tide, or even a storm surge, and that's what they were getting. They're getting that pushed in. We still can't figure out what vessel is. I can't find a wreck listed off of that area. We have a few places like that. But talking about storm action, and we think about today, think about this year, all the March storms. 1851, very similar problem. Minus Ledge Lighthouse. Anyone knows what Minus Ledge is off of Situate, Cohasset. It's a nice, beautiful granite lighthouse. And you get these photographs on this Blitz of 78 when the waves are going crashing over the top. Well, that was the second lighthouse. The first one was a steel tower with legs open. They thought this was a great design. The British were talking about they have a similar semi-submerged stone called Eddystone Rock. They're going to put a lighthouse out there. They were talking about doing this in the 1840s. They decided against it. We, on the other hand, said, they weren't going to use the idea, we'll use the concept. So they built a lighthouse, and it took them about 5 years to actually construct it because it can only work a couple of weeks a year on the rock to drill the holes, to put the footings in for the tower. Unfortunately, the tower was not a very stable component, pretty rocky. And I think what I find interesting, and maybe it's just me, but you see this rowboat, the longboat? Very similar to the one in the other picture. It's not identical, but there's a whole other story. If you look at the genre of postcards and photographs that are used for historic vessels, we have a wreck called the Jason in Truro. And there's a nice picture of it, totally wrecked. It's a disaster wreck. I love to use it as one of my opening slides. I've seen the same photograph attributed to a wreck in North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, and California. So manipulation is not unusual, but notice how the waves are coming up, and notice how it actually tumbles the tower. Well, in March of 1851, the second keeper, the first keeper, Mr. Dunham, lasted 10 months and just quit. Absolutely did not want to be the lighthouse keeper out there. The new keeper, Bennett, and his two assistants, Antoine and Swift, were out there, and it was a March storm came up in 1851, and he put a message in the bottle. I'm just going to read you the very end of his message. If it's God's will, I will die in the performance of my duty. That's how fearful he was of the storm action. About a month later, maybe 3 weeks later, on April 17th, he was on shore, but the other two keepers were there. They had a much more cryptic note that they left in a bottle. The lighthouse, oh God, I have to keep taking these off. And I have bifocals in here. The lighthouse won't stand over the night. It shakes 2 feet in every direction. and it went. And the bodies were found the next day and the day later, a good distance from, one was close in Cohasset, the other was up towards, I think, Hull. When they went back to survey later, this is all they could see of the lighthouse. A bit of the legs were still there, they snapped, they were cast iron, and some of the structure. And I just like to notice to mariners, because it mentions the fact that it disappeared. I would not want to be on that lightship that they put there for the next 10 years while they built the other lighthouse, because that's a pretty rough area. Now we come back to that wreck I showed you at the very beginning, wrecking ship versus shipwreck.
Yeah.
So we went out to look at this with the Park Service back in 2007. And this is beach erosion, as well as storm action. Most of the time you're going to see wreckage on the beach and you're thinking, oh, it's just uncovered. And that's usually not the case. Usually the case is that it's probably from about 300 feet to 300 yards offshore. Wave, wind, and surge picks up that piece of wood and pushes it, all that wreckage, up on the beach. And I'm going to show you another piece of wreckage in a minute. But so this wreckage probably went the same way, because we've got other images of it. We can see how it's not in the same position and so on. But we went and looked at it, and we were just puzzled. A local shipwreck expert author had given it the name, he believed it was a ship called the Lyman Law. So we looked at the Lyman Law, talked to some other researchers, and what his research failed to do, he didn't do his due diligence, that 3 weeks later the Lyman Law was refloated, brought to Boston for repairs. So we know it's not the Lyman Law. Also, we thought it was the keel, and it's easy, because you look at things, your mind has an image of what wreckage should look like. In this case, we were puzzled. And it didn't help that when the Park Service went down, and their architectural historian did I love the Baxter Park Service. When the architectural historians went down, they got some of the wood in there. They knew where the pieces were, but we had none of the fastenings. And fastenings were how they put together is the clues that archaeologists look and shipbuilders look to talk about where you are on the vessel and how it's built. They didn't note that it's been repaired. So you see that nice repair in the planking, the outer planking. But when we started excavating and got in on some of the ribs or frames, we noticed these nice little grooves. And we found out, oh, those are limber holes. That allows water to go back and forth through the ballast. So we were just above the keel. The keel had been gone, and this is a pretty massive but really flat-sided vessel, probably part of a barge. So now we haven't found a barge lost in that area, but it sort of fits that. But that's sort of, again, for us, it's exposed to storm action and most likely brought from an offshore wreck, or nearby offshore wreck, onto that spot. Other things to think about for coastal process and what we look at, here's another wreck through a series of side-scan images over 2 years. Different images show up because of sand movement. And people tend to think about the beach changing over the seasons if they're really knowledgeable about that process. But it also happens in deep water. So at 150 feet, you're still seeing this movement of sand, this transport. And in fact, that 2003 image, you really don't even see it because the sand waves have completely obstructed it. You see the sand waves in here a lot. And there are some, what we call artifacts of the side-scan sonar lines being put together. Unknown vessel off of South Beach, Martha's Vineyard, South Beach, Cape Cod. And we don't have any better image than this, so we'll probably never know, except it's probably a wooden vessel based on its overall shape. Now I talked about movement along the beach, we talked about underwater. This piece of wreckage in 2015 popped out, up above, not quite where the horseshoe prints were, but in the same general vicinity, so near Access Road 7. And we went out to look at it, and the first reaction was, this is from the Jenny Carter. Well, first, the currents run the opposite way in this portion of the shoreline, so it's not going to get pushed north by any imagination. But also, the Jenny Carter's been pretty beat for over 150 years. Well, not quite 150, but pretty beat. So the upper deck portions, or upper sides of the vessel don't exist. And what was fun for me on this, and I should have it in another image as well, is when we got out there, we could see the water line on this piece of wreckage. The the lesson here, though, is that long section that you see coming out, somebody decided they needed that more than nature, and they cut them off and brought them home. Hopefully they made nice furniture or something out of them, not just used it for just having wood. But that piece of wood migrated down the beach. So it went from Access Road 7 over the course of that year, or those months. Got hidden in the summer. We went out, you couldn't find hardly hair of it in July. And we knew roughly where it should be based on our GPS. So it came back out in October, and a nice drone image of it, done by Stephen Clayson again. And then we watched, and then in January it was up on the roads by Sea Glass. We believe that nature didn't bring it there, that probably someone that owned property there, who will remain nameless, probably removed it up there so it wouldn't damage their piles to their building. But in any event, that's now in the park over here at Salisbury Reservation. But it's kind of neat that it moves, and eventually it'll end up roughly offshore again. It would have eventually been dragged out. But we do get some clues that we know it's the midships of a vessel. We know it's above the bilge, but below the deck level. But nature also changes the shoreline a lot. And in 2014-15, a wreck showed up in Coffin's Beach. Unbeknownst, no one there, we could get a collective memory that went back about 85 years, no one ever saw a wreck on that beach. But we did research, came up with a couple of gill netters that had burned on that beach in the general vicinity. So we went out figuring we're going to go look at a gill netter. As we started to look at it and started to do the drawings, the drawing doesn't, this image is very poor, but when we did our outline, we could see how blunt the vessel was, and gill netters are not blunt vessels. They got a nice sort of pointy bow, that's for the best way to describe it to me. But this has got a really blunt bow, and shallops, and then Shabako boats in particular, have this kind of design. And we're still pretty much convinced it's on that early end. By early, anywhere from probably the Revolutionary War to the War of 1812 period. I'm always hoping it's earlier, because I want to find something really old, besides things I can buy in the store. And we did look at it, we found some interesting features on it that sort of confirmed that we think it's early but had a long life. First, we saw the draft marks. We got a Roman 6 up in the top left, and then the top right, we're using a GoPro and cleaning out the sand a little bit. We could see a Roman 5 on that bow, on the stem of the vessel, so we know that we have the draft marks. And this style of Roman numerals is an earlier period. As you got into the 19th century, they went to regular numbers, European Arabic numbers. So we know that it falls from that date period, that earlier section. Also, all the planking was large, wide. This had obviously been buried a lot because it still was not punky, it was still very firm. But if you look in this bottom left, I'm going to go over and sort of point out the features on it. So this is the stem. So you see that, there's the side view, the profile, and this is sort of a top view. That's one piece of wood. So you get 15 inches, 15 inches. It's cut out here. This vessel did not have a bowsprit when it was first built. There's a transition in shallops and schooners from going to having, and it changes again later, having no bowsprit to having a bowsprit added. And that's what happened on this vessel. Then the fun things. So archaeologists, we all say we're all systematic. Well, get kind of frustrated, and we're trying to find the keel, because we know we have the vessel, we can't find the stern. We think it's actually probably broken off. But we're reaching down, and we're right at the low tide interface at an extreme, like a -1 to 2 foot low tide, and we still are just backfilling with water. We can't get in. So we start reaching through that sand into the ballast, or hope to find the ballast, and we pulled out hard corals. And coral is both a ballast material and a cargo. Usually if it's cargo, it's sort of cut, lumpy, sort of squared lumps. If it's ballast, it's usually found off the beach, and it's usually rounded cobbles. This is brain coral. Brain coral is Caribbean. It's not even, Florida. It's far in the Caribbean, and there's a huge trade between sort of the North Shore, Salem to Suriname in the 18th century. And so we're thinking this may be, and they used open shallops, open Shabako boats. So these people are really tough. I couldn't go that far in an open boat. So we think we've got something that could date there, but it's only because the beach has changed for a long enough period of time that this area opened up, that these longshore channels came open, that we could find this vessel. So I alluded earlier to the Jenny Carter and that other piece of wreckage. This got out of order. It's like you're putting the slides in. I still do PowerPoint like I'm making slides in the old projectors, so you have to bear with me. But I love that you can see the water lines. We knew we were in the vessel. And then you see the Jenny Carter, which you can still go. If you go to Salisbury Beach and you get there low tide, you go by just south of the Sea Glass. That's visible. That wreck is visible. It's a big wreck. It's 165 foot of a ship still into that. Still the frames are there. These frames are not the same kind. They're both the same width, but they have got complete integrity. This is much from a larger vessel. But just to give you an idea of things we see, the clues we get out of the wreckage, that even that driftwood, we might be able to find a certain. We might not be able to do the DNA test, like, it's from the Jenny Carter, or it's from the Lehman Law, the Sir Francis, but I can tell what it might be from, and then I can narrow it down. And I'm going to get to a little bit of a story at the very end that goes with that. I talked about sea level rise without sort of alluding to it earlier. We actually have the problem of inundation and loss of habitation sites in Massachusetts due to sea level rise. This is the village of Billingsgate, Walfleet. Disappeared in early 1900s, before 1910. Had a baseball team up until 1901. This is the lighthouse. The light was taken and moved to, I think it's Lake Michigan. The building was moved into Orleans, Chatham, one of those towns. You come over here, there's the bell markers, but all these little dots, foundations from houses, still visible in the sands of this inundated site. So sea level rise wiped out this community that had been there since colonial period. We hope to get back out and do a little more research. I'm fascinated by the fact that I can still get out at low tide and look at it. A little bit of question whether who owns it, the state or the feds. I assert ownership, because I can get away with it. So it's probably be a fun story for me as a sort of a historian to get people to look at this site out there and then find the houses today and tie them back and forth. Because it's nice, that connects you to the past, but also connects people to the situation of what sea level rise can do. You have a realization of that. So quickly in summarizing, and I won't read this, I'm going to talk about the images, because you can read that. That's the usual, academic stuff. This is the Elk site, as we call it. It's a lightship in the Merrimack River. They didn't have lightships in the Merrimack River. It's, I don't know if any of you know Lowell's Boat Shop, but there's Graham McKay from Lowell's Boat Shop in there. This is what he did his master's thesis on, this shipwreck. That tree is growing out of the wreck. The river goes around it. I just like it because it's listed as the light vessel model number 1, or hull plan number 1. It isn't. Hull plan number 1 is 110 feet long. This is an 80-foot vessel. We have bow and stern. These wooden vessels built in the 1850s were sold out in the 1920s and 30s, and nobody's going to take and cut a vessel down. They're going to either scrap it or use it. They're not modifying it heavily. This probably fits the LV 5, 7, or 9, which were sold out in Boston. The LV 1 was sold out in Savannah, Georgia. Again, why would you buy a boat down there and bring it up here? Graham probably right that it's a lighter, and 2 of those vessels were used as lighters because of these big tanks. This is the Miners Ledge Monument. We put this monument down. It's actually on land now because it came up its monument holding piece. But the other vessel at the end is the steamer Lutzen. And it recently exposed out in Eastham. And what's kind of cool about that vessel, its name in the newspapers was the Notorious Lutsen. It was a very successful rum runner. And also they had it down to a skill of how to get your vessel outfitted, use it, and not pay any of your bills, and then have it set up for auction, and then buy it back. It's all reading the Bahamas, Bermuda papers rather. It had a murder on it. I think the first mate had to shoot one of the crew who was going to attack him. Probably was a dispute over shares. But it eventually, after Prohibition, it still kept freighting out of Canada. Ran aground there carrying a cargo of frozen blueberries in the 1930s. I didn't even know we had there was a trade in frozen blueberries. I mean, it's sort of unusual, but they offloaded that cargo very quickly. So I always have that speculation. Was there something else on that vessel that they didn't want anybody to know about, but that blueberry cargo story really gets everybody's interest and distracts them? So with that, I'll bring this to a close. And counting history might be a walk on the beach. This is the Ingomar down here, about a good hard walk below parking lot 3. I hate doing that walk, carrying gear. I really hate it, but to me, it's my art shot in the bottom. What's neat about this wreck is everybody knew it was Ingomar. I have to be a doubting Thomas. That's the way I'm trained. I go out, Ingomar, I think, is 110 to 120 feet long, and all I ever see is 80 foot of wreck. And now, granted, wrecks break up, and I could show images of broken wrecks, but the way it was laid out on the beach, it looked like an 80 foot wreck. Then a few years ago, we went out, and Graham came down, because Graham actually sits on our board. He was my intern, and then he now is my oversight board member. We went down there with some students, and we're looking at it, and there was one piece that looked like a mast. And it's just like, boy, this is really beat. But beyond that, we saw more material. And it fit the length of the Ingomar. And then we knew the Ingomar had a transom stern. And Graham was looking at what we thought was the mast, and he goes, just shook his head, looked at us, and he said, this is the rudder post. You can see here where the gear would fit right in, and everything lined up, and then we can confirm it's the Ingomar. The other two vessels are so much smaller that it couldn't be them. There are two other vessels in that general vicinity, and they go nameless right now. But it was nice to finally confirm what would be an anonymous wreck and a fun walk, thing seen a lot, to say we know it's definitely that vessel. And with that, I'll answer any questions. If I don't know the answer, I can make one up to make you happy. I have some handouts here if you want them. If you don't, I won't be offended. Well, thank you very much.
I'm so surprised that there's that much, now I don't know why, there's that much tidal movement. Is that true? I took a course with a guy named George Bass one time, and he's going after boats that have been down for thousands of years, right, and pulling up stuff.
All that sexy stuff.
But there's just tons of movement.
Yeah, well, here, I mean, what the whole coastal process, people don't even realize what goes on. I mean, even as being trained in the field, and as over time as I do more, coming out of doing ancient Native American prehistoric archaeology, doing ship and vessel archaeology for various reasons, it's that whole natural process. People don't realize that it's, there's a long-term process, there's a seasonal process, and it's very evident here. I mean, I go out to these beaches a lot, and I like to go in the winter, mostly because most of the beach is gone. It's actually sand that's just dragged out, so what I'm looking for is exposed. In fact, I have to come back here, I've got to talk to one of the staff about going out to look at an anchor down below 5, between 5 and 6, if it's still exposed. And because those plovers are out, and I won't make any comments about them. But, so I have to be escorted when I'm down there. But even looking at the images, I can't always tell what something's from. I can get a rough age, and maybe by that rough age say it may go to this vessel or that vessel. But when you look at these beaches, and especially in Massachusetts, we get 3,500 plus wrecks. Probably a lot more. I got one list that's 5,600 that we got to play with. But in any event, most of those, majority of those vessels, I would say 75%, and that's a rough estimate, are schooners from colonial period to the 20th century. And then the next biggest group is fishing vessels, many of which were abandoned versus lost as casualty. And so there's, I'm just closing this as we talk. As I lose my train, the process to find those and identify them is really, it's not as easy as we think. Even when having lists, precision, what we want for precision today, people didn't want 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. The communication, like us, we get our GPS, I love it, I go out, take my pictures, I've got it, now I know where I am, thank God, because I can never use the big GPS unit, I'm always screwing it up. But I can see change in some of these pieces over the years. Jenny Carter's pretty static to me, but there are times when it's more exposed and I can see some of the granite that it was carrying for cargo. But it's where the beach changes a little bit. We do beach nourishment, that covers it up. We put beach armoring, that covers it up. Not so much the wrecks, but it changes the way the sand moves. Well, look at here at the northern tip of Plum Island. You get that little bit of change with the jetty being replaced. And that was, I don't think, was an anticipated change. So we have to look at all the natural forces and process to see what can happen with them.
That's amazing.
Has anybody attempted to come up with a plot of sea level versus,
They
fixed
actually have
stuff
some-
like rocks over, say, the last 20,000 years?
Yeah, there are a few maps out there. The scale is kind of what we call gross. It's kind of hard when you come down to the level of looking at a locality,
Yeah.
because most of the time the data is driven by current contours, which actually are today's contours. They're not the contours in ancient times, so you have to do a little more work. They'll probably get more that, plus sea level rise and glacial change. There's a lot of different factors that are involved. So, for example, we have what they call rebound. So the glacier retreats, you get that void, but then the ground springs back, and then it sort of settles down a little bit. So they have to look at, on these rebound charts, where that area might be, and then it's really looking at cores. We have to really look at core samples to determine where we are.
What would be a good place to go looking for that kind of data?
I don't think there's any one good place. I'm actually just reading an article that's probably written 20 years ago, not that long ago, by Fitzgerald, and I can't remember who the rest are. But Duncan Fitzgerald out of Boston University has done a lot of local research in terms of sea level rise, and I can't think of his first name. The last name is O'Dale out of Woods Hole, did a lot of research. And they're still refining these charts. We require this when they're doing cable work, for a lot, like a big power cable coming down, or the LNG line, or for the wind farms, for their cables when they cross into state waters. We're asking for reconstruction, but it's a very narrow strip, but it does get a greater process, but it's someone to sit down and get some, and there could be a dissertation or thesis out there, and most likely from BU, but I'm not sure, that sort of talks a little bit about that. So it's more that kind of sleuthing at a more academic level to find it. I know, I wish I had the time to do it. I find it fascinating. I've worked with a lot of geoarchaeologists now, students that are coming through the system that are more interested in these processes, and also looking for the sites that are associated with them. Because I've always thought we'd find ancient Native American sites out on off our shores, as well as in our rivers and lakes and ponds. But it's taken probably almost 20 years of my career before people started to accept that that's a possibility. I know it didn't really give you the source place to go, but...
Good question.
Other questions? I can tell stories, I know some fake.
Some of the questions that you have in your mind, perhaps you want to hold on to them. And 2 weeks from tonight, Nancy Powell, who is the refuge's wildlife biologist, will be here doing a presentation on climate change and Plum Island. And so Nancy might be
more knowledgeable about some sources, Tom, that might be of interest to you. So I encourage you to come back here in 2 weeks and hear Nancy Powell.
Thank you.
Thank you.